Hello, hello. Welcome to my channel and number 3 in my podcast series, The Foundation of Culture in the U.S., Music. And today we are talking rock and roll. Before we get started, if you found value in any of my previous podcasts or anything else on my channel, please consider liking, sharing, commenting what else you'd like me to cover, and last but not least, I guess, subscribe. So, as I mentioned in my previous podcast, I tend to go in chronological order unless the person that was born later had more of an impact on that genre of music. But as it was before, it still lines up that the originator is the older one. And if you have not guessed who I'm going to talk about first, I'm surprised because it is Sister Rosetta Tharpe. Yes, 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 yes. I'm sure you've heard of her. If you are a lover of rock and roll at its roots, where the beginning truly manifested, then you know Sister Rosetta. Now, she was born Rosetta Newman. They actually have her name as Rosetta Atkins, and that was on March 20th, 1915, and then she passed October 9th of 1973 at the age of 58. Now, before I get started, some people may know some of her gospel stuff because she wasn't just instrumental with rock and roll, but blues, gospel, rhythm and blues, jazz. So she had a footprint kind of in a little bit of all of this. Now, she not only played guitar and sang, but she also played the piano. Now, she gained popularity with her gospel recordings in like the 30s and 40s, and they described it as a mixture of like spiritual lyrics and electric guitar. You see the pictures of her and you see the joy, the true joy that is like illuminating her and exuding from her body and just obvious and kind of in your face when you see these pictures. You know that she loved, loved, loved what she was doing. Now, I mentioned spiritual lyrics. Now, she grew up in a Pentecostal church, and she became the first recording star, like the truly great one of gospel music. And then she was one of the first gospel musicians to like appeal to like rhythm and blues and rock and roll audiences. So she was expanding because you hear about musicians and they start in one genre, and then probably a contemporary version of that is maybe Taylor Swift. She's doing country, and then she goes to pop, or Beyonce when she's doing her thing, and then she goes over to country, even though she said she's a country girl at heart always. And so you hear about these other musicians that kind of do kind of a little bit of everything. Now, what was her nickname? She was referred to as the original soul sister and the godmother of rock and roll. Now, before you start, you're like, oh, she was not that influential. She influenced Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Johnny Cash, Carl Perkins, Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, and then that I just love, Tina Turner. So all of these people that are just like saying what happens, and I mentioned this before, what happens with these different genres is that the Black musician will put all the roots, get it baking, right? They've planted all necessary things. They've done the recipe, and then white musicians will come along and it'll be made mainstream, right? And it will have more like success across various audience. Now, as far as her guitar technique, she was a pioneer. She was like one of the first like popular artists that were recording to use like heavy distortion. So you think of all these genres of music that use heavy distortion. She was doing it first. And then before all the pedals and all that to like make it happen, she was doing that before that was an invention. Pedals were not around, right? So she was doing that. Now she was with her doing this and with her like taking this approach, she was like the electric blues. She was just bringing that in. She was just bringing that in. Now, one thing that she's also credited with is having like a like profound instrumental like kind of in your face influence on the development of British blues in the 60s. And that was because of her guitar technique. So with her tour that she went on in Europe with Muddy Waters in 1964, and then she stopped in Manchester, England on May 7th, and she like was seen by like people like Eric Clapton and Jeff Beck and Keith Richards. Now, when you think of guitar players, come on, you think of those, right? You think of those. And so she like had an influence. Now she was willing to like kind of mix it up between like, because some people are like, you know, you do gospel, you don't really do anything else, even though it has a wide umbrella as far as like styles of gospel. You know, there's like a difference between Kirk Franklin and like Mahalia Jackson. There's commonalities, but there's like there's a difference, and you know it depends on how they're trying to appeal to their audiences. And so, but she was not really like she was not adverse to that, and so she would do like nightclubs, concert halls with big bands behind her. And so they talk about the light and the dark, you know, between all that, people that are like, you know, that's the music of the devil, you know, rock and roll music is music of the devil. You know, you've heard it. You've heard it. So, you know, imagine being the originator and having to contend with that, with people like pushing against that. But she was pretty stern. She just was like, I'm going to like push my spiritual music out there, and I'm going to help give a footing to pop gospel. And that was started in 1938. And then in 1939, she did This Train. Now, in 1939, with This Train, she did that. But before that, in 1938, she did Rock Me. Now, it left to just as like this, you know, when you're so like influential and you're a pioneer in the way that she was, she left a unique like mark musically. She just had to, because she was she was such a trailblazer, right? And I've been wanting to say that word for so many of the musicians that I've been covering, and I know that she is truly, truly like the trailblazer and showing what a woman can do. Now, in 1944, she released Down by the Riverside, and that was the National Recording Registry. They selected that for the U.S. Library of Congress in 2004. And they're saying that it's like her like guitar playing, it captured her spirited guitar playing and her unique vocal style, which you definitely should listen to. And it like showed her clear influence over early rhythm and blues performances, and her influence on gospel, jazz, and rock artists. How can you argue that she did not have a fundamental part of starting that? So when they talk about the contributions of Black citizens in the United States, but they're listening to this music that even, you know, some country songs have some kind of influence in the guitar playing that was rooted in what she established, was dug up from her garden. Now, there was, in 1945, I want to talk about this one. This is called Strange Things Happening Every Day. Now, it was recorded in 1944, and it had her playing guitar and singing, and she played on piano with Sammy Price, and then it had bass and drums. So he did all three, piano, bass, and drums. And it was the first gospel record to officially cross over, hitting number 2 on Billboard. Now, you know what they called it back then? Race records. Mm-hmm. And then that later became the R&B chart in 1945. Mm-hmm. Now, this one recording is being cited as the precursor of rock and roll. And it's been called the first rock and roll record. Now, she was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2018. Of course, that's after she passed. But I just I just am in awe of her. I'm in awe of what she decided to do, the influence she had. Now, I'm just going to do a quick rundown of her childhood before I just pop on to the next musician. But she was born in Cotton Plant, Arkansas, and her parents' names were Katie Bell Newman and Willis Atkins, and they were cotton pickers. Okay, now there's a couple of researchers, Bob Eagle and Eric LeBlanc, they gave her name as Rosetta Atkins or Atkinson, which was her mother's, with her mother's name being Katie Harper. So a little bit of a difference. Little's known about her father, except that he was a singer. And then her mother was a singer, but she also played mandolin. She was a deaconess, a missionary, and then she was a speaker at the Church of God in Christ. Okay, now that's a Black Pentecostal bishop started that, Charles Harrison Mason, in 1897. But yeah, they encourage rhythmic musical expression, dancing, and praise. And you think about, when I talked about blues and rooted in the existence, the existence is rooted in the trials, tribulations, hardships that slaves and enslaved people experienced, and that was an outlet for them. And so this is when she started, encouraged by her mother, to play guitar. And she was at the age of 6, and she was called Little Rosetta Newman, and she was called a musical prodigy. I really think that there's so much more to know about her. She toured Europe in 1964 with, I mentioned that before, but it was like a caravan with Muddy Waters, Otis Spann, Ransom Knolling, Little Willie Smith, Cousin Joe, Sonny Terry, Brownie McGee, Reverend Gary Davis. In 1964, there was a concert that was recorded in the rain by Granada Television, and it was done in a disused railroad station at Will Braham Road, Manchester. So I tell you, that show, it influenced pretty much everyone who saw it. It's funny because there's a biographer that he in 2018, the biographer was talking about how she influenced Elvis Presley and Johnny Cash and Little Richard, and then he asked her about her music and rock and roll. She said, "Oh, these kids and rock and roll, this is just sped up rhythm and blues. I've been doing that forever." She had a stroke in 1970, year after I was born. I think it was year after I was born. Let's see. Yep, year after I was born. And I would have been around 1 year old. 1 year old. And because of that stroke, her legs were they were amputated. Complications from diabetes, which is definitely an issue in the Black community, and it's something that runs in my family, and so we have to always be cognizant of that. And so she died in Philadelphia as a result of another stroke, and she was buried in the Northwood Cemetery, October 1973, when I was 4. Guys, What do you think? Do you think that she was the originator, godmother, special sauce mixer, trailblazer that I think she is or was and will always be? I think so. I think she is. I'd like you to weigh in, comment, share it with somebody else who might want to debate it. And then let's get ready to move on to the next musician. Okay. The next musician on the roster is Chuck Berry. He's from St. Louis, Missouri. What? He's from Missouri? I knew it, but it was a little bit of a reminder. Very, very cool. I've got relatives in St. Louis. I'm from about a couple hours away. I think it's a couple hours now if you try and drive it now. But yeah, he was born on October 18th, 1926, and he passed away March 18th of 2017. Both of them were in Missouri in different cities. I tell you, we saw him, the Hubster and I, Josh and I, we saw him play when I was pregnant with my son, the musician. We saw a few people. We saw BB King play. We saw Willie Nelson, some other musicians, and yeah, Chuck Berry was absolutely amazing. So this would have been in 2006 when we saw him, and I tell you, we're like blown away, blown away. Okay, so let's learn about Chuck Berry. He was born Charles Edward Anderson Berry, and he was a singer, of course, guitarist, songwriter, and he was one of the original pioneers of rock and roll, as you know. You know, you can't think rock and roll and not think Chuck Berry, right? You can't. So they call him the father of rock and roll. Okay, so Sister Rosetta Tharpe, godmother, he's the father of rock and roll. Because I guess you got to give him that disclaimer, but I think that, Sister Rosetta was the originator, and he was influenced, and he like pretty much brought it to like another level, because and it goes they describe him as refining it, and he developed like rhythm and blues and like these major pieces to it that made rock and roll distinctive, and made it something where you hear it and you get it. You hear a Chuck Berry song, it's Chuck Berry, right? Because of his styling and everything, it's him. Now he did like Maybelline, Roll Over Beethoven, Rock and Roll Music, Johnny Be Good. So there's some of his hits, and he wrote lyrics you see a lot of musicians that kind of do that nowadays. Still, Taylor Swift, I bring her up again, where they're focused on teen life, but he also tackled consumerism, which I think learning that about him, I thought that was pretty interesting, because you think of someone during that time thinking on those lines, that's more of a modern like mindset, or like maybe people in like I guess people in like the 60s might have been thinking that. But his style, and you think about it, you see him like his knees are bent, and he's like scooting across he's doing his signature move across the stage, holding his guitar low. And that was like his showmanship, right? And his solos were insane, right? So he actually was born into a middle class family, and at an early age, he really was like interested in music, and he gave his like very first summer high school performance. Excuse me, his first public performance at Sumner High School. And you think about what is it, Back to the Future, and how they're covering that's supposed to be his first performance, like he's supposed to be at that school and stuff. It's interesting. Now, while he was in high school, unfortunately, he was convicted of armed robbery. Or I say unfortunately, but convicted of armed robbery, and he was sent to a reformatory. Now, he was held there for 3 years. After he got out in 1947, And he got married and he started doing like a automobile assembly at a plant. And then in 53, he was influenced by the riffs and showmanship techniques of blues musician T-Bone Walker. Now, T-Bone Walker, I may cover him at a later date because he's definitely a musician more people need to know about. If you don't, you know the whole if you know you know you're a music lover and you like foundations of music and where it all originated from, you're gonna know who T-Bone is, right? But cover it for the masses, right? So he began performing with the Johnny Johnson Trio, and his big break came in 1955 in May in Chicago. That's where he met Muddy Waters, and he suggested he contact Leonard Chess of Chess Records. Now that's where he's recorded Maybelline, and it's a adaptation of Ida Red, and it sold a million copies. Think about it back then, a million copies. Black musician, rock and roll music. What? Million copies. And it was number one on Billboard's rhythm and blues chart. So then he's a star. He has all these hits, and he established a nightclub in St. Louis. It's called Barry's Club Bandstand. And he went to prison in 1962. Aye, aye, aye. He had, under the Mann Act, there was an offense. He had transported a 14-year-old girl across state lines. You could only guess why. Now, that's where you get like, it's like you say, don't learn too much about your heroes. Don't learn too much about your heroes because you're bound to be disappointed. You're bound to be disappointed. And when I read that, I was like, I kind of, sort of, I heard about like, why am I blanking? That was like involved with his cousin, I think. But you're hearing, the things that happen, and that's not a good thing. But he got out in 1963 and he had more hits. But I still had to cover him because this is the foundation of culture. And with all of his flaws and all the things that I would consider unforgivable as a human being, you acknowledge his involvement and the footprint he left just as it is, because it is a true fact, and it is what it is. He did that. So let's go on and finish up. Okay, so he was inducted into, he was one of the first musicians to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which I think that was really, really cool in 1986. And they said, they said that he laid the groundwork for, I'm just reading this, for not only a rock and roll sound, but a rock and roll stance. Of course, he was on Rolling Stone all the time. And yeah, they talk about like the 500 songs that shaped rock and roll. And they talk about Johnny B. Good, Maybelline, rock and roll music. They talk about that. And then they talk about the 100 greatest artists of all time. He's the second greatest guitarist of all time. So he ends up being in lots of lists, lots of lists. Now, we're going to do just like we did with Sister Rosetta. We're going to give you a brief snapshot of his early life, so you can just know, because sometimes you learn about it and you're like, did something influence his behavior later in life? Let's see. Okay, so he was the youngest child. of Henry William Berry and Martha Bell Berry. And her maiden name was Banks. He grew up in North St. Louis, neighborhood known as the Ville, and many middle class people lived there. His dad was a contractor and a deacon. We hear the churches at a nearby Baptist church, and I grew up Baptist. You hear the influence of um, growing up in the church through many of these musicians, and you're going to hear it more. And so I think that is a really important thing because church became a way to solve the wound, and to heal, right? And to find a reason why things were happening and commune together in that, right? So hearing that a lot of these musicians were, they were heavily, like they grew up in the church is not a surprise. Now, his mom, Martha, she was public school principal. So his because of the way he was raised and his family situation, he was able to pursue music at an early age. And he had, I mentioned the performance at Sumner High School, and he was a student in there till 1944. That's when he was arrested because he had robbed three shops in Kansas City, Missouri. That's I have relatives there also, so we call it KC. And then stealing a car at gunpoint with some friends. He says that his car broke down and he flagged down a passing car and stole it at gunpoint with a non-functional pistol. That's what he said. So he was sent away to the correctional center. And then he started he formed as like a singing quartet and then was boxing and stuff. And they became like competent enough that they allowed them to perform outside the facility. So that probably earned him some points, and he was released on his 21st birthday, but that allowed him to leave, so that's probably good. And then I want to say that like when he married, his wife's name was Toddy. That's her nickname. It's the Meta Suggs, but they called her Toddy, and she gave birth to Darlin Ingrid Berry in 1950. And I'm trying to remember if, because there was a child of his that was at the concert. I wonder if that was her. Okay, so he supported his family by taking various jobs in St. Louis, and then he worked as a factory worker, and then the assembly line, which I mentioned, and he trained as a beautician at the Pro College of Cosmetology, which was wild. And he was doing well enough to buy a small three room brick cottage with a bath, and that was on Whittier Street. And it's now listed as the Chuck Berry House on the National Register of Historic Places, which I think that is very cool. And so, yeah, there's so much more to learn about him, but we're going to skip ahead to when he moved to Mercury. Um, when he was released from prison, I mentioned 1963. He um, he's returned to recording and performing, and it was made much easier now because British bands were like doing it. And so, probably America wants to get a bite of it, and they're like, okay, we have to do these black musicians, we're going to have to do it. But the Beatles and Rolling Stones were the notable ones, right? And there was still interest in this music. So other people, like other bands, like reworked some of the songs, like the Beach Boys did. And then that's Serving USA. And then they used the melody of his Sweet Little 16. And then he in from 1964 to 1965, he released like 8 singles, which I think I don't know if that's considered a lot during that time. I would think he would have released a little more than that, but that's the amount he did. And 3 of them were successful. So that's not too bad. No particular place to go. And You Can Never Tell, and Nadine. And between 1966 and 69, he released 5 albums for Mercury Records, including a live album, which was his second live album, which is live at Fillmore Auditorium. And he was backed in that album by the Steve Miller Band. So that's really cool. I learned that and I'm like, okay, that's cool because I didn't know that connection. But sometimes you like when I've seen different musicians play and I'm just like, okay, you're like, oh, okay. They kind of like bit off of each other. So, reading Miles Davis book and things like that, you learn these things. Um, so as far as like his studio work period, it wasn't really successful. Like, like he could go and play a concert, people would come because he's such a good show. His showmanship is like next level, and so trying to do the studio albums, it just wasn't hitting the same. But after he went on tour in the UK, when we returned back, and that was 1965 in January, his behavior started becoming like erratic and moody, and like his touring style of using like unrehearsed local backing bands and having like a strict non-negotiable contract was earning him like kind of a reputation of a difficult and unexciting performer. So I don't know. You think about that, and you're like, okay, And I was like looking at pictures of him performing, and I'm like, I think he wore that outfit when we saw him play. But we're gonna skip ahead to his death. And he was found unresponsive in his home. So they tried to revive him, but they were unable to. So he was pronounced deceased by his personal physician. And you can like they have the audio recording of the 911 call, which I will never ever want to hear. But he's, like I said, learning about your heroes, there are controversies with there are still, because they'll never go away, controversies in regard to his um, you know, assaulting women and installing video cameras in the bathroom of his restaurant and finding videotapes of women. And then, the whole marijuana thing that, I'm going to go pass on that. But you still can't, even with learning all of this, you still can't get away from the fact that he had a tremendous influence. And he's there. That's the reason why I chose to include him in this podcast. Okay, so that's it for this part 3 of the Foundation of Music series, covering rock and roll. I know that I could expand this podcast to include other musicians, but I want to, if you can envision it, I want to build kind of a ladder or a stairway to the culture that has been influenced by things of the past so that you can understand how relevant the Black community is to the foundation of the US and how it cannot be swept aside, denied, taken for granted. There's too much cultural appropriation and taking a stance that just because of skin color, you are less capable and you have less of an impact and you have less potential, that needs to be squashed. So doing this series gives me my opportunity to talk a little bit more about. I know that it's not polished. I know that I want it to feel like it's just a conversation, right? So you can stop it and you can be talking to me if you want to, or you can be talking to me during. But I want it to feel like we're just kind of sitting, we're talking about these people. So um, it's not polished. I'm just starting off with doing this type of podcast. And I really hope that you enjoyed learning about these two musicians, Sister Rosetta Tharpe and Chuck Berry. If you were not familiar with them, you now are. If you didn't know too much about them, you're more informed. If you know more than me, share, share, share. And put links to, like, if there's articles or information that you know about them, you can actually put the links in the comments. If there are genres of music you would like me to cover, let me know, because we're moving on to part 4. Will be coming up shortly, and that promises to be a really good one. If you did find you've listened this far and you found value in this podcast, please subscribe. I could use more. I'd appreciate that. Okay, guys, cats and kittens, thanks so much for listening. I do appreciate you. And thank you to my 15 subscribers. You rock my world. And we'll see you on the next one. Okay, bye.